This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. Young women today are used to having professional jobs, playing sports, access to birth control or abortion, owning property, having a credit card. But in the recent past, and I mean by this, the generation of their grandmothers or maybe great-grandmothers, this was not the case. My guest today is Susan Williams, who is here to tell her stories of the evolution of women's rights movement and to show us that we've come a long way since her days at CalState Long Beach in the late 1960s. To introduce Susan, I picked out a few items from her impressive resume: a master's degree in marine science with a specialty in sea worms. She has concentrated her work years primarily as an environmental scientist and an educator. Add to this a variety of jobs like National Park Ranger and teaching human anatomy to seminarians, and also teaching in the City of Ventura Natural History Interpretive Outreach Programs. Very impressive. Hi, Susan. We're so happy to have you here today.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Susan, let's start with a bit of biography on your longtime work in environmental monitoring. What did you monitor?
Well, it was mainly in the marine environment and basically concentrating on the critters that lived in the bottom of the ocean, because if there's a disturbance, either man-made or natural, they just have to sit there and take it.
Oh, poor guys.
Yeah. So that would include things like monitoring offshore outfalls of treated wastewater. It would do like the monitoring of any offshore resource development, even in harbors like Marina del Rey and Long Beach Harbor, seeing what the conditions were there.
Uh-huh. So what about the specialization in sea worms, those critters at the bottom?
Well, actually, earthworms of the sea are...
Oh, so they're actually like earthworms.
Yes, they're related to earthworms. The technical word is polychaete. And they comprise a good majority of the critters that do live there, so it's important to know about them. And how I got involved with them is my master's professor concentrated on pollution studies, and especially with those worms. And so that's how I got involved. I mean, he even raised them in the laboratory there.
Oh, so because they just have to sit there, they would contain or retain more of the pollution?
Yes, or they could also... actually what we do is we look at the animals that are there, how many different species. Some species are indicators of a disturbed environment and such. So...
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to hold on the sea worms because I'm going to ask you back to talk more about the environmental aspect here. But for now, let's sketch a picture of your days at CalState Long Beach as a science student, a serious science student, during a time of campus activism in the late 60s. This was the time of the women's studies movement. So were you... could you fit a women's studies course into your busy science curriculum?
Oh, yes. Well, actually, in the women's studies movement started mainly in like the early 70s. In the 60s, when I started there on campus in 1966, watched the evolution of the whole anti-war movement. So at first is the anti-war movement, and then a little bit later on, it was the women's movement, women's studies movement on campus. And also at the same time, we were getting into the environmental activism, which I was also involved in.
So it's all related.
Well, yeah.
So you were at a state university. Do you think that students at a state university were more receptive to social justice movements than a private college like USC, where you later did research?
I think so, mainly because, well, for one thing, state universities were a lot more affordable. When I started there in 1966, for a full 18-unit load, the student fees were $52 a semester.
Oh my gosh, it probably costs that a minute now.
Yeah, really. So you had people that could afford to go to the college. Long Beach State was also like a commuter college, so you had a lot of students from, the general vicinity. And once they started the Equal Opportunities program, that brought in even more students, even a more diverse student population, you had, I think, the ability to be more receptive. Now, we had lots of different populations there on campus, from the fraternity, sorority people to the athletes to the art students to the whoever's, you know. So there was a pretty good population there, and a lot more open-mindedness about certain things, I think.
It was sort of the times, though.
Well, yes, definitely.
Yeah. So how did you get interested in women's rights? What's the etiology of that?
Well, it might go back actually to 8th grade. In my 8th grade social studies class, we were supposed to do research on career. Of course, we had to get it okayed by our teachers, so I said, okay, well, I read National Geographic magazines for years and years, so I said, I want to be an archaeologist.
Cool.
And so my teacher said, girls can't be archaeologists.
What?
Go pick something else. I said, okay, fine. So then I picked medical technology, which is more socially acceptable for women, besides which both my parents were, so that was easy. Ironically, years later, when I went to work for the City of Ventura's Interpretive Outreach Program, I was one of the people doing the archaeology programs for school kids.
Very cool. You got there anyway.
Yes, I did.
So was your mother a good model for you?
Yes, I think so. She was always a very assertive type, And when she was in college, she was actually the first woman to graduate with a degree in medical technology from Hamline University. And then she was also, I remember she was very delighted when women could finally get credit cards in their own name, because before that, if you were married, it had to be in your husband's name. Now, the thing was, my mom was much better at financial management than my dad was.
Yeah, same way as my
well,
family.
actually, because like her family used to run the general store back in Minnesota, and she'd done bookkeeping, so she was more up on the sort of thing.
So women were really marginalized by not allowing them to have a credit card. That's kind of unheard of now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, there has been some movement. So what about you mentioned earlier your maternal grandmother, that she was into women's rights too.
I heard just a little bit. I had heard that back in, I think it was 1911 or thereabouts, she actually organized the women that worked in the office at a flour mill back in Albert Lea, Minnesota.
Oh, activism.
Activism. And in later years, she actually bootlegged colored margarine across the border from Iowa.
Oh. I guess
but
we
that's
all
another story.
have that stuff in our closet. Now, your mother got college certification in medical technology in the early 1940s, but later when she worked in California, I think it was a clinic you mentioned?
It was a hospital, yeah.
A hospital. What did she find out about educated women technologists?
Okay, now here's the deal. So my mother had a college degree in medical technology. Then then you have to get licensed or certification or whatever. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. Well, she found out that she and the other med tech were actually making less than the janitor at the hospital. So
and she had more education.
Yes. And so they went on strike, and it was actually covered in the Long Beach paper, and I think they did actually get a raise.
Oh, very good. So you have a sort of history in your family, especially on the maternal side, What kinds of activism did you get involved with when you were on campus?
Well, I was kind of marginally involved in the anti-war movement. I went to some of the speeches and whatnot. But remember, I was a full-time science student.
Uh-huh.
And so I had to deal with that. Plus, I was also in the honors program, which was also a pretty intense liberal arts thing. And I was on the archery team. So I was
pretty busy.
I was pretty busy, yes. And then I did get involved with the women's movement on campus, with the Women's Student Union. I was editor of their newsletter. And then also I was involved with the environmental movement on campus, recycling. And I was actually the student member of the campus Environmental Practices Committee. So I managed to do that.
Yeah, wow. Ask a busy person. And you also said you set up the Women's Resource Center. I was wondering how this center assisted women and some of the contributions you made to setting it up.
Well, actually, the Women's Resource Center came about as a result of some demonstrations about a part-time professor that didn't get hired. And one of the demands that was made was the establishment of a women's resource center.
Oh, is that the Betty Brooks?
That was the Betty Brooks thing.
Uh-huh.
But meanwhile, as part of that too, I was mainly the editor of a campus and community resource guide for women. Now, not just the students, but also is for faculty and staff.
Uh-huh.
And the name of that was Every Woman Can, if she can find it, if she can find those resources.
Oh,
Okay. And it had partly on-campus resources, including academic and activities and organizations, community resources, and it was published by the Women's Commission at Long Beach State in 1974.
Uh-huh.
And that was one of the things that was available at the Women's Resource Center. It was actually a small area in the Student Union building, and it was staffed part-time, but they already they had the resource guides to hand out and such. And now
and so what kinds of information did it carry? Was it reproductive or other resources?
Well, the based on this resource guide here, there's some academic stuff, the Learning Assistance Center, library resources, intercollegiate sports. They had things on the various organizations, and also there's a child development center for childcare on campus. There's a family planning clinic as part of an offshoot of the student health services. So these and career management. And so there were all of these things that depending on what your needs were, they provided the resources or the direction and the referrals on them.
And you kind of helped put that all together.
Well, I was one of the people. There were very many people.
Uh-huh. So this is what Betty Brooks, who wasn't rehired, what did she do to... or not do?
She asked questions.
Oh, okay.
And the main thing was, her main issue was the inequality of funding and resources between the men's PE department and the women's PE department. Now, I could definitely relate to that because when I was on the archery team, that was an intercollegiate sports and that was done under the women's PE department. And so when we traveled to tournaments, even out of state, we had to take our own vehicles. We only got $5 a day for meals. And I don't know what we did about lodging, who paid for that.
Right.
We stayed in some really interesting places. But at any rate, so Betty was finding out a lot about the various financial support, which brings me to something else. One of the interesting things she apparently found out was that the men's PE department paid more for jock straps for the football team than the entire budget for the women's intercollegiate sports.
Wow, that is real discrepancy.
Yeah,
Yeah, recently had Jackie Irwin, who's the 44th District Congress or Assemblywoman
Hmm.
for California, and she in the 90s in high school wanted. She was a swimmer, but there was no women's swimming team, and she said she every day she went to the principal and asked to, when are you going to have swimming for women? And they finally did. They finally
Yeah.
found the money for it, but it just kind of shows how long it takes to have parity. So, something that is still needed for social justice for women is something we talked about earlier, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, that was first introduced right after the suffrage movement, the right to vote, in 1923. And it was finally passed in Congress in 1972. So, like a almost 50-year span, but it still hasn't been ratified. And do you know where it's at right now?
Well, I thought that it was kind of dead in the water, as they say. But then I saw on a cable news program a couple of weeks ago that apparently it's still alive, and that recently Virginia and Nevada passed it, so they only needed one more state. And they figured, well, maybe there isn't a time limitation because, after all, the 27th Amendment, which was introduced like in the 1700s, right after our nation was founded, it took until 1992, 202 years to get that thing ratified. So why is there a big? I'm sorry.
Why is there
Why is there a statute of limitations, as it were, for the Equal Rights Amendment?
Oh, right.
So they're hoping that that's going to pass, especially because we've had a lot of changes in the state legislature makeup that might be a little bit better.
Right. Well, we're going to have to take a break here, but
Okay.
we're going to come back to the ERA and its significance in our lives. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Susan Williams, who is here to tell her stories of the evolution of the women's rights movement and to show us that we've come a long way. Okay, and we're back. Let's just get back to the ERA for a moment. A good fact for our listener to know about is that it takes, for any amendment to be ratified, 3/4 of all the states have to individually ratify it. So where we're at with the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment for women, and I'm going to ask Susan to read right now what the ERA would guarantee.
Okay, the ERA would guarantee equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
Okay, so things like discrepancy in budgets for women's sports would not exist if the ERA is ratified.
Well, actually, that came under Title IX. So if Title IX was actually fully applied, but things like maybe things under like divorce, pay equality, other issues like that.
Oh, so sports wouldn't come into it, or could there be a test case on that?
It could be, but I think right now with sports, you're coming basically under Title IX. But I mean, I suppose it could, but this issue about sports is more on the state level. Although I will say this, like with a lot of professional women's sports, especially like tennis, like with Billie Jean King, developing more equality for prizes for the tournaments.
Okay.
And then also like there's a variety of things, but it would certainly help with a lot of issues we have ongoing today.
Right. Do you believe that equal rights for women is the law of the land?
No, because there is still a lot of inequality in a lot of issues, like with health care, Again, like with pay equality, things are better than they were before. But, when I first started at Long Beach State, women made 59 cents for every dollar that men made. Right now, 40 some odd years later, it's 80 cents. So we haven't really come that far, although there are some companies that are really trying to
have parity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, let's go back in time with you again. It's the PreRoll V Wade period, 1969, and it's before the women's movement blossoms. And you are a serious science student, as we mentioned, on campus with plans for your career. What happened to you that year?
Well, I became accidentally pregnant.
Did you have access to contraception?
Well, at that time, I think most of the college students were kind of depending on a combination of the rhythm method, rather.
Right.
And condoms.
Uh-huh.
And in this case, the condom failed.
Okay. So did you have adequate contraceptive information?
Well, maybe, again, like right now, it was like, at that time, it was like we thought, okay, fine, condoms would be fine, or, the rhythm method, where you were on your period.
Uh-huh.
I don't recall having a lot of contraceptive information available, but later on campus, like several years later, we did have the family planning clinic.
Oh,
and
so moved forward.
Yeah.
So were you kind of thinking of getting married or dreaming of being a mother at that time?
Oh, no. I did not want to be a single mother, and the guy was not into being a father or getting married or anything.
Right. So you wanted to complete your degree.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
definitely. I mean, it's like, hello, I didn't want to be a single mother. I mean, I'm supposed to have a career. I need to finish my degree. This is not going to work.
Right. So what did you do?
Well, what I did is, at the time, I went to the free clinic, Long Beach Free Clinic, and that's how I found out I was pregnant.
Were you pretty frantic?
Let's just say the only time I ever had any suicidal thoughts was when I was pregnant and I was driving my car and I felt like running into a telephone pole and ending it all.
Oh, wow.
So I was definitely upset.
Yeah. So was abortion legal in 1969 in California?
Sort of, kind of. They had apparently liberalized the abortion laws in that I was told you had to go before a panel of about like 5 psychiatrists that said to determine if you're going to go crazy if you had the kid, and then if you passed their test, then you had to go find a doctor or a place or a clinic that would actually do the procedure. So, because it was very difficult to get an abortion in California then, the free clinic actually referred their patients to this place down in Mexico. Now, it was very clandestine. I mean, it was very underground. You had to call this guy in Chihuahua, Mexico, and then he would give you the directions on how to get there and whatnot. Now, no, abortion is not legal in Mexico. However, I think if you paid enough money to various officials, they would just kind of turn a blind eye,
Uh-huh.
So that's what I did.
So you had to kind of bribe them?
Well, I'm not sure how it works in Mexico. Okay, all I know is that I had to pay. The operation was $500.
Uh-huh.
Plus airfare down there.
And
now,
is abortion legal, or was it legal in Mexico at the time?
No.
Oh.
And so again, but it was a really good clinic. Now the problem was, the guy that got me pregnant, I told him, he goes, "Oh, well, I'll take out a student loan." I said, there's a time limit here, guy. I have to have this procedure done within a certain time frame. So I had to tell my mother that I was pregnant because we had a joint savings account. So I had money in the savings account, but I needed to have Mom to get the money out.
Right.
So the thing was, my mom was a bit upset, but see, she was a med tech for a doctor's office that included OBGYN guys. So she was a bit understanding, but you know that when I got back from Mexico, she got me on the pill right away.
So that's quite a story. So do you feel you made the right decision?
Oh, absolutely. For me, it was the correct decision.
Uh-huh. Because you wanted to have a career.
And the other thing, yeah, I wanted to have a career. Plus, I also knew, and this is also very important, I knew I would not be a good parent.
In what way?
I don't like kittens. I like grown-up cats. Let's just put it that way.
Right. Well, it's a fair and legitimate way to feel.
Yeah, you see, and that's it, because if I had gone through with it, I could see that I could have gotten like really upset, annoyed, impatient with the child, and I could have very well done child abuse. And so I knew that I was not a good parent material. Some people are, but I'm not.
Right. Well, that's quite an important self-assessment. So do you feel like that the women's movement has come a long way and that things are, even though they're not exactly where we want them to be, that things are better for women?
Well, in general, things have progressed in the last 40 years, When I was at Long Beach State, aside from like the microbiology department, there weren't that many women in the science classes.
Oh.
In fact, as far as I can determine, looking at the commencement booklet from when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, as far as I can determine, I was the first woman to graduate from Long Beach State with a degree in marine biology.
Wow.
Okay. Now you have a lot more women in science, including like in engineering. You have women in construction in a lot of the maybe untraditional jobs. So there's been some definite progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, I think if the ERA is passed, that will help eventually.
Right.
But I'm also very heartened by a lot of just general activism right now that's going on in various sections of like social.
You told me about a T-shirt you have, and it sort of relates to women having to be out on the street again, marching to protect the possible removal of their basic rights.
Yeah.
What is that T-shirt?
Well, actually, I think it kind of speaks to several of the social movements going on. Actually, I don't have the T-shirt. I've been looking at it in a catalog. It says, "I don't believe we're still protesting this stuff."
Okay, we're doing it again.
Yeah, it's deja vu all over again.
Yeah. Oh. Well, anyway, thank you so much, Susan, for coming in to share your story and your personal struggle before the women's movement and your activism during the movement. We'd love to have you back to talk about your work as an environmental scientist. And I want to hear more about those sea worms. I find that very interesting.
Well, yeah, the other thing, even though mostly I've done environmental stuff, is my latest detour was into gerontology administration. So that's another story.
Okay, well, we're going to find out about that too. I can see it coming. Okay, for comments, questions, information, or if you would like to be a guest on the show, you can email me at radio@capsmedia.org. Type in the women's room in the subject line. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good.